Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday, and I welcome you all to our exciting next chapter of the School of Architecture lecture series, Curating Urbanism in a Drawdown. And I welcome both members of the School of Architecture community and those attending the 8th annual conference of the African American Intellectual History Society that's now taking place on campus. The conference theme of IHS, We Can't Breathe, Catastrophe and Sustaining Community in Unlivable Places, resonates with SoAs as we consider platforms for practice in the context of rapid urbanization, urban injustices, climate change, and associated other conditions. So today we welcome Kathryn Yusoff, Professor of Inhuman Geography in the School of Geography at Queen Mary University of London. And as Blaine and I met with Kathryn a couple of weeks ago, I love her title, and she explained to me that she had the agency to define it. And I'm just wondering about faculty in attendance, if you could pick your own title, what would it be? That'd be a fun little exercise. Kathryn's research examines how inhuman and non-organic materialities have consequences for how we understand issues of environmental change, race, and subjectivity. She is author of A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, that was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2018, and I highly recommend it. And her forthcoming book, Geologic Life, Inhuman Intimacies and the Geophysics of Race, that will be published by Duke University Press, is on its way, and it addresses the histories of geology and the gravities of race. So please join me in welcoming Kathryn Yusoff.
Thank you so much, Brooke and Blaine, and also Bridget for organizing my virtual visit. I was just saying that it's hard to get back into Zoom after we've kind of stepped off that platform and kind of come back into real life talks, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today, and for your patience in this medium. And yeah, I really wanted to sort of put some ideas together that have come out of the recent book, Geologic Life, that I've been working on, and put them together with this kind of challenge of architecture as a way of thinking through some of the kind of spatial formations that I'm used to thinking about as a kind of geographer, as a historical geographer, and a kind of and someone interested in social theory. So this is the kind of, this is sort of my imagined conversation in a sense between architecture and some of the kind of ideas around the geographies of race and geology. So maybe I'll share my screen if that works. And we'll get, great. Everybody can see that okay? We're good? Okay, fantastic. So as I said, I want to put together some of these ideas that I've been developing around race and geology with the kind of question of the kind of verticality of architecture and how we might imagine the verticality of architecture. And really, like, I've been very interested in the relation between racializing undergrounds and the kind of material production of ongoing architectures of modernity, and how this production of natural resources instantiates an effective architecture of violence that is ongoing and often without a immediate subject. So I'm going to talk about this through the granular geographies of Alabama and some new work that I've been thinking about in terms of race and the built environment, and this conversation is part of that. And so for those of you that have recently been on that field trip, I hope some of this work will be resonant with what you've been thinking about on that trip. So as I said, I want to kind of join up this question of vertical architectures, of the kind of verticality of particularly sort of the surface and subsurface and mine with kind of built environment over ground, and some of the questions around Anthropocene architectures of planetary architectures and thinking about the kind of the earth as a kind of praxis of geoengineering or architectural practice. And really to kind of think about some of the deep histories of urbanism and the kind of coloniality of space and spatial relations that are kind of maintained in a sense through these architectures, through kind of Anthropocene architectures, but also these kind of vertical architectures of modernity. And hopefully this will kind of lead us on to thinking about kind of architecture as a geologic practice, and not just in terms of our kind of choices of materials, but as a kind of as an actual praxis that is involved in a kind of political geology of the earth. And then at the end, I really want to think about what reparations and repair in colonial earths might look like, and some suggestions about how we might think about this in terms of architectural practice. So as I said, I want to connect the vertical with the kind of the sort of effectual architectures of voluminous cities. So the kind of verticality of the city is bound up in imaginations of urbanism, but rarely do we kind of stray to imagine the mine that materializes the city, or the fungibility of race relations that are bound up in its geologies. So geology and its kin network of extraction, natural resources, architectures of geomorphic transformations of things like dams, river straightening, climate change, and the kind of redistribution of geologic materials, whether it's as kitchen sinks, nuclear bunkers, asphalt, or any other kind of materiality, are also all involved in the geochemical redistribution of energy. So things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. And all of these go through a geologic grammar and become a kind of a mobilized, a normative mode of materiality. So it's this kind of normative mode of materiality that I really want to take apart, and to think about how we can think about geology and urbanism as the kind of result of a fossil fuel transformation. So the built environment as urbanism is reliant on fossil economies and the mining of metals and minerals. So even the kind of diamonds from mines in South Africa, for example, are tied to the fabrication of New York and the kind of the cutting of stone in skyscrapers. But we also live on a planet that is now more urban than it is not. So urbanism is a kind of planetary force in and of itself. But the question that I want us to kind of pause around are how are kind of racial conditions of extraction historically and materially organized? And how might we map the effective and material architectures that constitute the making of natural resources that become the architectures and their kind of material, mythic and subjective registers? So another way we could put this is, how do we think about an embodied geology and its spatial relations as racialized and racializing? If we understand materiality as a colonial organization of the empirics and praxis of matter. So if we understand materiality not as a kind of given, but as a history of kind of geologic relations of colonialism, or what I call white geology, then we need to begin to think about the kind of implicatedness of that in current sort of architectural projects. So in a number of different disciplines, the kind of underground has come into the fore as a sort of subject to study. So obviously there's kind of work in extraction studies on subsurface resources. In geography, there's a lot of work around subterranean cultural practices, but also in Black studies and political geology, thinking about the underground as a kind of radical space of praxis. In human geography, there's been work on volumetric and depth geographies, and that complements work in Anthropocene studies by kind of scientists around urban strata. So thinking about the city as a living fossil that is metabolizing earth processes. There's also kind of work on vertical territorialization, so kind of contestations between the state and territory of the underground, as well as the kind of control of surface and subsurface as a kind of geopolitical tool. So what I'm kind of really interested in within those kinds of domains is this kind of question of the politics of surfacing and narrativizing. So how do things get from the underground? What's involved in like bringing things from the underground and narrating their kind of distribution on the surface of the earth? And if we remember that distribution, particularly of fossil fuel subsidies, is also kind of the basis of climate change and planetary transformation. Sorry, just let me, oh, here we go. And so I want to put that those kind of questions of the underground in relation to what we might kind of think about as Anthropocene urbanisms, where particular spatial forms come to define this surfacing of materiality. And I've written before about the kind of mine as paradigmatic of a kind of negative architecture of colonialism and modernity. So the kind of, for every building there is a mine. And we could think about the construction of these architectures, these negative architectures, as being organized through a kind of racial deficit. So they rely on racialized relations to actually generate kind of a surface landscape. I'm going to talk in detail about Alabama in a moment, just to kind of show you what I mean about that. But we can think about this, we can think about these terms almost as a negative urban dialectics that kind of performs this axis of racialization, of planetary formation. So a kind of urban dialectic between the kind of the sort of what is on the surface and above ground and what is below. And the city is this kind of praxis for exchange, but also for changes of planetary state. So it's not just the kind of the state as a kind of political formation that's involved, but also changes of geophysical state in terms of climate change, but also these kind of much more sort of granular geographies of a kind of racial geopolitics that exists within urban space. So if we think about the long histories of kind of the earth and its transformation, there's what we call the Anthropocene is really actually colonial earth and the kind of production of a set of relationships of the transformation of the earth through colonialism. So if we take seriously these lasting effects of the kind of simultaneity of exclusion from time and geography that colonialism performed, and how this established racialized identity, both as kind of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, then there's a need for a fundamental rethinking of these kind of operational zones of geology. So coloniality produced a particular formation of race and geology, often named as kind of productive, as destiny, as a kind of form of geoengineering. And this is very much the kind of the set of relationships that has led to the kind of instantiation of the Anthropocene. So integral to that is the violent ending of worlds, the coercion of material practices towards these kind of, forms of practices of colonial economic botany and extraction, as well as the kind of iteration of other earths as kind of marginal. So as sort of shadow geologies, as ways of producing other forms of kind of material practice as kind of other earths. That are not kind of prioritized and often kind of violently suppressed within the kind of regime of geologics of colonial earth. So we can think about these as kind of geo-social formations, and this is kind of one of the ways in which myself and a colleague have really kind of thought about the connections between geology and social as producing and process kind of led formations that actually transform particular kind of strata of the underground into kind of social and political agency. So we can think about this interchange between geologic depths and temporalities in the organizing of social and material worlds, and particularly in terms of the mapping of race. So if we think about architecture, for example, as a geosocial formation, then it's the outcome of and organizes processes of materiality. So it's kind of implicated in the kind of transformation of the earth, and through particular kinds of praxis. So within colonial worth, for example, we can see whiteness is a product of a history of extraction. So if we think from the long histories of colonialism, from the theft of indigenous land and its exhaustion in plantations, to the deep subsidies of fossil fuels. So then the white settler family is a kind of stabilizing force in what we could understand as an extreme form of materialism or just extraction. So but the key thing about these kind of modes of extraction that are organized through kind of racialized undergrounds is that they give rise to kind of stratal geopower. So whiteness is not just a kind of ideological formation, but it's a form of kind of stratal geopower that arranges a whole set of relations. And one of the consequences of that kind of arrangement is the way in which inhumanism has become a mode of subjectivity. And by inhumanism, I mean the kind of proximity to inhuman materials, but also this tie between the inhuman as a kind of category and the inhumane. So it's produced as a historic form of subjectivity through enslavement, but it's also kind of enacted through proximity to inhuman materials. So both of it as kind of extraction in various forms of coerced labor, and the geophysical shocks, so of exposure, pollution, poisoning. So inhumanism was a political geology that was argued by geologists in the 18th century, such as Harvard chair Louis Agassiz, who declared actually in a meeting for the Association of Advancement of American Science in Charleston, South Carolina in 1850, that races were well marked and distinct and did not originate from a common center nor from a common pair. So he was advancing a theory of polygenesis that proposed that human beings of different racial types didn't share a common ancestor. So that was very popular in the South, particularly in relation to the kind of amateur geologists on plantations. But it positioned race as a kind of natural occurrence, and it organized, as you'll all be aware, race as a kind of a form of strataled kind of proximity to different kinds of earth relations. And this also kind of is tied into kind of political formations of subjectivity and the geopolity of race. So something like the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court in 1856, which was very much informed by the natural histories of people like Agassiz, gave the inhuman classification of enslavement a ontological determination. So that whether free or enslaved, that certain categories of persons, Black African Americans, would not be included under the term citizenship in this decision of the Supreme Court. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this dispossession was argued under the terms of natural history. And when the decision was printed, it was printed with a accompanying kind of dossier on natural history. So it collated a subterranean placement for Blackness outside of the state, but within its borders. So this is really just to say that kind of racialized materialisms fundamentally shape the categorization of inhuman nature across both poetic and propertied orders. And they rely on this kind of articulation of nature, of deep time to do racial work. Which in turn promoted a normative form of kind of geochronicity in narratives of racial life, of kind of, and that's how, if we think about sort of the progress narrative, and even in the way in which kind of development is organized through kind of in post-independence states as a kind of, as a sort of temporal narrative about kind of becoming kind of developed through certain kinds of transformations of natural history resources, for example. So extraction we can think of as a racial geophysics, as a way of shaping categorizations of peoples coded as kind of property or as kind of less than human, but also kind of it's about a kind of a normative form of narrativizing racial life in relation to certain forms of development. So kind of nature is not just a racial category of personhood, it also becomes mapped into narrating materialism, so particularly through ideas of development. So we can see kind of extraction as establishing a racialized geophysics in the production of urban space and its forms of segregation and stratification. And both these are kind of internal to the city and settlement, but also external. So they have kind of spatialities outside of the city. And we think, if we think about here about the spatialized effects of race outside of corporality and identity, then we can begin to see how we can conceive of race as a kind of material praxis of exchange, of unequal relationships. So this is kind of also tied up with thinking about the colonial afterlives of kind of the material world. So particularly in terms of infrastructure, what are the basis of renewal? And I would argue the natural resources as both an episteme and extraction are kind of one of the key sites in which kind of colonial lives maintain themselves. So there's a picture here of Cecil Rhodes, and it's like after Cecil Rhodes has fallen, the infrastructures still remain. So there's a kind of, you know, the identity might be kind of obscured, but the infrastructure still continues. So this is the kind of, this is the issue that that I think we have to kind of grapple with, is the quiet work of infrastructures in terms of their renewal of a certain set of racialized relations. And this is just to give you a quick sort of diagram of what I have been thinking about in terms of kind of geologic life and this connection between natural resources as kind of colonialism and its afterlives that is organized through extraction and capture. So epistemic capture of kind of identity through racial politics, and material enclosures for the production of value. So personhood in both enslavement and indigeneity are kind of organized as a form of extraction, a form of capture and extraction. And that leads to forms of material, spatial extraction and containment, and subjective enclosures. So to see those two things as interlinked and necessary to think about together rather than separately as a kind of an identity politics that is just about a kind of ideological organization, but actually is very much underpinned by material conditions that sustain those epistemic descriptions. So within this, we might think about kind of the mine as a paradigmatic space, as mines and negative architectures of matter that sustain surface architectures. So We can think about the mine as both a mine, but also as a sort of epistemic formation. So a mine can be a detention center near the border. It can be a beach in Morecambe Bay, a late night cleaning crew in the city of London, a prawn fishing boat in Indonesia, a Malaysian palm plantation, for example. So extraction is all around us. That's the point I'm trying to make, is that the mine is what sustains the kind of surface functioning. Yet the mine also generates a set of hierarchies between what's undergrounded, erased, and what is accumulated on the overground as built environment, but also as value, and how kind of accumulation is managed across these states. So given the kind of colonial relation of white supremacy and the kind of theft of indigenous lands, coupled with the development of mining as a key infrastructure of colonial wealth, and we can think the plantation within this as a form of strip mining, as a kind of another kind of mine. The mine or the underground can be thought as a spatial model that is enabled by racial deficit. So this racial deficit creates a vertical urbanism of racialized geosocial relations. So if we think about the mine as paradigmatic, because of what it institutes in terms of spatial and subtending relations, methodologically, we need to think about a geophysical approach to race, and understand race as a geologic proposition by which kind of architecture is implicated within its forms of production. So if we understand race then as a geologic proposition, this is also a way to open up the implication of inhuman materials and the relations of extraction that go kind of beyond a place-based configuration of something of environmental racism, for example, as a spatial organization of exposures to environmental harm. So it's about kind of expanding out those terms of how we understand the kind of materiality of race. And I want to kind of turn now to Birmingham, Alabama, as a space where this relation is very much on display. And we can see here, just in the terms of these kind of images of Alabama sort of articulated as a kind of place for immigrants and capitalists, and the sort of development of a city from kind of scrubby fields, very much modeled on the imagination of the other Birmingham in England as a kind of heartland of industrialization. And Birmingham mobilized convict leased labor to create its urban center in New South, as well as the production of iron and steel for the nation. So if we connect up the kind of raising of a city with a set of carceral conditions in terms of convict leased labor and the ongoing kind of idea of the kind of manpower resource and racialized manpower resource, as we know in the kind of prison complex, then we can begin to see how cities rise through these kind of racial deficits. And if we think about the kind of the long emancipation, as Ronaldo Walcott calls it, and think about how this is maintained and reproduced through material architectures, one of the spaces in those kind of in those maintenance of material architectures is the kind of the geotrauma of kind of materialization of race. So the ongoing kind of geotrauma of the materialization of race, which is organized through the kind of material exchanges of the built environment and of the earth. So we can see architecture as a site in this reproduction of racialized relations, as well as kind of understanding how the kind of shift and through kind of the shift through material architectures becomes part of how political subjectivity is understood and narrated. And I just wanted to show you those of you that went to Alabama last week will probably have seen these. And these are some descriptions of the kind of transformation of Birmingham. And there's one on industrialization and one from the Equal Justice Initiative on racial terrorism and convict leasing. And you can see two very different articulations of and memorializations of the kind of transformation of the city. So one emphasizes the transformation of nature into natural resources, and the other one clearly kind of addresses the erasure of racial terrorism and the convict lease, which very much challenges the category of the convict lease as labor and as a kind of a form of labor, but rather as a form of kind of racial fungibility. And as just to kind of give you a sense of the city and the kind of building of the city, the empire building, and what was called Birmingham's Grand Canyon, that as the buildings went up, the mines went down, or rather the mines went down and the buildings went up. And crucial to this was the production of steel and the conversion of fossil fuels for both kind of the making of iron and steel, and also the kind of power networks that connected and made the city of Birmingham, as in England. And the city of Birmingham in England was also based on the payout from the legacy of slavery. So that it was that money from the end of slavery that mobilized the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So there's very little that remains in terms of kind of an evidential narrative, apart from the work that the Equal Justice Initiative is doing around Alabama and around kind of the disappearance of men and boys into the convict lease system. And this is one of the few kind of images, photographs of that kind of other urbanism. So that kind of what sustained and maintained those buildings that we've just seen. And this is a photograph of the convict cemetery of Pratt Coal and Coke Company that operated Pratt mines. So where the iron was mined with convict lease labor. So young men and boys kidnapped by the state under the pretense of vagabonding geographies, to both kind of clear social and electoral space, because obviously convicts weren't allowed to vote. So it was a way of kind of the execution of social space, but also the kind of transformation of that space. So if we think about the kind of, there's lots of maps of the geology of that region, but there's a kind of sparsity of material traces of this other geography that is the kind of the inhuman basis of materiality, both kind of obscures and overrides. So these kind of more intersubjective modes of material experience and exchange, so the kind of lives that caught up in the mine and the furnace. So, I mean, just to give you one example, in the cemetery in Pratt City, a convict like John Clark might lay. So he was convicted of gaming in 1903, unable to pay the fine. So he ended up at Slosh Sheffield Mines, and he was bought from the state for £9 a month. So working off the fine for his crime was 10 days hard labor. But the fees for the sheriffs, deputies, and court officials that derived their wage from convict fees added another 104 days in the mine. So a month later, according to the inspector's report, John Clark was dead by falling rock. So there's just one example of a life that gets submerged into these kind of inhuman geographies with little trace or kind of remembrance in the city of Birmingham. So we think about how building on structures of property under slavery, convict lease labor extended this long arm of extraction over Black subjectivity, while relocating the power from the plantation master to the corporation via the sort of white state, while also reorganizing kind of the terms of gender and sexuality in historically new ways. So these mineral modes of categorization of steel, iron, coal encapsulate the inhuman. So we're used to thinking about these as the kind of building blocks of buildings, right? But they also become a stable form of property for extraction and a kind of lexicon for making non-historical objects. So as kind of subjectivity gets mapped into this grammar, it is the kind of steel and iron that comes to the track as kind of shiny, and the bodies of the incarcerated that routinely disappear in the heaps of the kind of cast off matter at the prison shaft. And there's a parallel inhumane grammar deployed in the property category of Black life as kind of carceral life in this organization. And you can see here, this is a close-up of Pratt Mine, and the shaft is going off to the mine at the bottom. So the prison leads directly into the mine. So it is a prison mine, and it's part of the regulation of value of immaterial materials. So we can think about how minerality worked in the underground is transformed on the surface to flows of social power, and how this continuing and enduring structural relation of racialization is kind of entirely dependent on a subterranean racial ordering. So the prison mine performed the material stratification of an epistemic condition of a liminal Black understrata. So a subterranean convergence of subject and material conditions. And the Alabama Board of Inspectors Convicts report suggests that there were no records kept of these people, what has become of persons sentenced to hard labor prior to 1883, of whom there is absolutely no trace. They have disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them. The very fact of their existence has been forgotten, except by a few at the humble home, who still wait and look in vain for him who does not come home. So this inhumane life of a swallowing earth in subterranean worlds reproduces the weather of kind of broader social forces. And it was how the heaviest corner on earth, as it was called in 1909, was built. So with mass incarceration, Black life became recast as property of corporations via the state, who took over from enslavers. So geologist reports formed a crucial part of boosting for this northern investment. So this is a relationship between the South and the North that got developed through the organization of natural resources and their extraction, and the use of convict labor as a kind of covenant of that natural history. So the coal industry rapidly developed in 19th century, spurred on by huge fortunes. But it was very much funded by kind of a set of relationships that enabled the production, the very cheap production of natural resources. And some of those, and that was obviously policed by a kind of a white state and a white law. So race becomes weaponized in the convict lease as a means to mobilize natural resources. And in 1898, Alabama obtained 73% of its total state revenue from the sale of persons coded as convicts. And that was primarily to the mines. So Tennessee Coal and Iron, which took over from Pratt and Sloss, and later became US Steel, became the world's first billion-dollar corporation. So we can see this kind of direct link from Alabama to the world's first billion-dollar corporation listed on the stock exchange in 1901. So it was the largest business enterprise ever launched in America. And it made 65% of all steel produced in the US, and 30%, at that time, 30% of global production too. So it was also kind of had a planetary impact. And we can see some familiar names on the Steel Corporation. Is very much funded through kind of the stock exchange in New York, and we'll be familiar with some of those names like Charles Schwab, Gilbert Gray, JP Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. So kind of familiar names in capital terrain. So we can think about these micro spatialities of race in urban space as vertical, as kind of propping up the heaviest corner of the earth, between 20th Street and First Avenue North in the Magic City. So race is made here as a spatial effect of both the narratives of material redemption through the tellus of development and modernity, and the spatial architectures of the industrial city that maintain those racializing relations. So urban planning and the maintenance of hierarchical racialized relations continue to build these worlds through the combined sociologies and geologies of race as a kind of new aesthetics of steel and iron hide the hurt, telling a story of this kind of an autonomous, kind of materiality of modernity. So Black life is caught in the dynamics of these kind of geologics of the architecture of coloniality and then modernity, which kind of continues those sets of relationships through kind of overgrounds and undergrounds. And at the same time, we have the kind of material transformation narrativized as a kind of achievement of whiteness. And I don't want to valorize labor in the service of a national project here, but rather to kind of point to the undergrounding and the erasure of young Black men and boys that ushered in the new possibilities for white industrial pride and white working class masculinities organized through the settler family. And we can see that still kind of those questions around whiteness and post-industrialization still mobilizing a particular kind of set of white body politics in the present. So I want to move now really to think about kind of the gravity of these kind of racial geologics and a gravity that was built on the backs of a kind of disenfranchised population that got pushed deep into the earth and who ground these edifices of white supremacy and their floating billion-dollar shares. So what held up also pushed down. And I think here, moving to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, we can see this kind of lithic eye view of the Corten steel that hangs above as a kind of material transcendence in this kind of social text of matter. So as the kind of color line of geology is really mobilized in this space as a kind of materiality of settlement of coal and steel, and how they become part of the migratory possibility of white supremacy, making undergrounds as they go, and undergrounds that can move and grow and had a kind of projectile force in their extractive principle and their carceral logics. So this is kind of settlerism by depletion. And we can think about challenging the narrative of materiality. And I think this is what this space does in terms of its corporeal histories, but also to open up these historical geographies of the prison mine. And for those of you that haven't been to the space, it very much kind of draws on that industrial history to organize the space and effectual architecture of its accounting for history. So the suspended ingots materially mark the steel and iron industries that were fueled by convict lease labor in the coal mines of Alabama. and if the walkway actually descends under these suspended steel points. So it is a subterranean viewpoint that takes the viewer below the hanging bodies of metal. And I think this architectural perspectivism hangs the optic above the viewer. It hangs the kind of weight of these undergrounds taken overground. So it's a lithic eye view, but it is a story of this relationship between an underground and overground. So if we think about architecture as a geologic practice, as a kind of exchange of kind of relations, then what does repair and reparation look like in colonial Earth? If convict leased labor promoted a reproducible model of racial capital while simultaneously enabling the spatial execution of social space that was kind of aimed at maintaining a white judicial command of the political surfaces of the southern states, then we need to kind of think harder about the way in which these forms of material production are still kind of enfolded into and organized through material relations. So one way the Equal Justice Initiative is thinking about some of these things is through kind of like remobilizing a set of community practices around here, the collection of earth underneath kind of lynching spots. And I think it really this really directly speaks to, in its kind of aesthetic mimicry, to geologic core samples, the very kind of geologic core samples that would have been the kind of the start of the mine, in a sense. So thinking about these kind of historic divisions between inhuman and inhumane practices and how they organize the formations of subjectivity in overt and intimate ways. There's a recovery of a specific racial geology as a kind of alternative way of forging what kind of, I think J.T. Rohn thinks about as a kind of methodological repair, the methodological repair necessary to account for Black life. And we can think here also about the work of the late geographer Clyde Woods as a kind of looking at these granular geologies as a way to think about kind of both a sort of testament, but also a set of kind of practices around retrieving the unretrievable. So to draw attention both to those kind of violent acts within the Black archive, but also to surface the erasure of those kind of histories. And this gives a very different account of the Magic City. But I think what it does is it insists on our recognition of the earth as inhabited. So the earth as, and geology as embodied. So I just wanted to kind of leave really with an architectural practice that I've been really inspired by. And this is the work of Cave Bureau, who are based in Nairobi. And they've been using the kind of space of caves that were often used in the East slave trade, so not the kind of the West African slave trade, but the East African slave trade, as kind of spaces of community, organization, discussion, and to think about these spaces as a kind of prior architecture to colonialism. And they've been mapping kind of, using LiDAR and so on to map these cave spaces in order to generate a new kind of architectural practice for the city of Nairobi. And this is kind of called the Maasai Cow Corridor. And what it does is seeks to kind of traverse the British colonial city that was arranged around a kind of apartheid of race. And it addresses the kind of relationship with non-human and human relations that were displaced and kind of spatially marginalized. And in the case of the Maasai, they were either confined to national parks or tourist brochures, and not allowed to wander with their animals through the city. So what Cave Bureau have done is kind of propose this kind of whole sort of cave network to run across and above the city, with things like salt licks for animals and vets, and kind of, so a whole infrastructure of human and non-human life that redresses the impact and the ongoing impact of the colonial city. And just my own practice with colleagues Kerry Holden, Casper Lane-Neberson, and artist Michael Salu on planetary portals. And we've been thinking about kind of the colonial afterlives of gold and diamond mining in South Africa, and thinking about planetary portals as a way to kind of draw attention to the kind of how portals of time and space and kind of materiality sustain these kind of relations of extraction. And that work has really been trying to tie up the kind of Rhodes estate in the East End of London to kind of the ongoing legacy of mining in South Africa, and to think about how these shadow net architectures are kind of organized through the quarries and shafts and mines. And we've been kind of thinking with this term portal as a kind of speculative archival method for examining these geosocial inequities that sustained kind of spatial imaginaries. And we've been working with the artist Michael Salu, who's been who also has been producing sort of films and text alongside our archival investigations. And this is just at Transmediale, but just thinking about kind of other ways of narrating and thinking about these material histories is also kind of a way of really drawing attention to the possibility of the non-renewance. And that's just a picture from Transmediale last month. So really to leave you with a question, and this is kind of what I think is at stake in both the sort of Anthropocene politics and its racial politics, and that is that where does a building begin and the planet end? And if we ask this another way around, how is planetarity, the Anthropocene as a product of colonialism and racial capitalism, implicated in urbanism? If we think about planetary paradigms for racial equity. So if we think about planetarity as a product of colonialism. So what are the planetary paradigms for racial equity in racial urbanisms? And I'll leave it there. So maybe we can, that gives us enough to pick up in terms of thinking about a set of questions and conversations.
Kathryn, thank you so much. That was wonderful. As a side note, after reading your Minnesota press book, Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, I was just curious how you might present as a presenter in terms of the language that you would use if you would read versus speak sort of off the cuff. And you, I'm struck by how sort of effortlessly and fluidly you convey these very intricate concepts that expand our thinking. So thank you for that. Just quickly, and I'll hand things off to Jonathan and Brooke, and I know we have some students that want to ask some questions, but one of the, and maybe Brooke is frozen temporarily, but one of the I guess I have a set of questions or curiosities regarding how to interpret or theorize alternative or sort of counter means of extraction in a time when we're trying to move from sort of hydrocarbon to carbohydrate economy, so to speak. A book that comes to mind relative to your, you talk about mining, not just about mines literally, but sort of as sites of extraction and colonialism. a book that comes to mind and a topic that comes to mind is, for example, illegal logging. And the book, Lindsay Burgon's book, Tree Thieves, positions this question of natural resource harvesting, sort of subversive or illegal harvesting, as a more complex issue than we might think. That you hear about tree thieves, oh, this is sort of a very polar, very obvious issue, right and wrong. But in fact, when you think about the livelihoods of farmers trying to stake more ground, deforestation, or let's say rural residents, or residents in the hinterland that are simply trying to take advantage of local resources, sort of positioned against larger forces, trying to sort of fight against the large sort of lumber companies that are extracting in certain ways, raises really interesting questions about I guess I'm wondering about your thoughts regarding how to think about extraction today with regard to sort of planetary resources, but also the balance of power, and how to not colonialize as we have in the past, how to support populations through resources, but also with regard to this question of a drawdown. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as you point to, it's a really complex question. And I think that, a lot of the movement around new green technologies is, around kind of lithium and rare earth metals and so on, brings a lot of these questions really to the fore. But I guess that, I mean, I don't think there isn't a kind of paradigmatic kind of fix-all for extraction, but I think there's I think the non-renewal of kind of racialized and racist relations is a key kind of question to ask in that kind of formation. So and that's where I think sometimes with the kind of scale of things, that when we begin to talk about scale and the kind of big it up for the Anthropocene, or big scale for kind of new green technologies and so on, then maybe that misses some of the iterative steps in ways in which certain kind of ways of doing kind of natural resources are organized. So I know this is not going to be a kind of like, I don't have an answer for that, but I think there's a set of questions that have to be asked along that kind of trajectory, right? So it's even before kind of natural resources become natural resources, and I think that's what kind of indigenous protests around water is life is, it's insisting on a different epistemic organization of, that it's not resource, it's life. So it's insisting on a different language of those materials, and it's also insisting on a different kind of epistemic relationship between humans, non-humans, the earth, and so on. So I think that there needs to be kind of the development of new languages. And I think that's where maybe kind of architecture is suddenly in this position to play a really important kind of role in terms of thinking about what that looks like and how it functions. So as a process and an outcome, it can do both those things. So it can, instigate a new set of discussions, but also, that's what I love about kind of Cave Bureau's work, is it shows how you can intervene in the colonial city, right? How you can begin to think about, sort of before and after. So like using some of those kind of histories as a way to think about the future, which I find really compelling.
Great, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, so we've got a few students here. Elijah in particular has a question. I think it's kind of piggybacking off of what Blaine was asking. But Elijah, go ahead and take it away.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, it was the lecture was fantastic, very enlightening. Most of the questions I did have were answered like further on in the lecture. But to kind of piggyback off of Blaine, since this like capitalist colonialism still is like impacting daily life, socially, racially, and had impacted the material economy, like I guess what ways can designers or architects counteract that like damage that has already been done while still using materiality and while still pushing for like building, because that's what, a lot of architects will do that. Like, so what are ways that could possibly, I don't know, break that mold that's been set for so long?
I mean, I think kind of thinking about the ways in which, I mean, I think it's a tough question, right? Because all materiality is kind of like, it involves some sort of like set of production, right? And conditions of production and so on. And but if you think about the way in which we narrate materials, like steel, it's an autonomous material. Like, we don't want it to have kind of affective associations, right? It's like, we want it to have this kind of clean narrative of matter. And the same, kind of with, the marble that's in the Capitol, for example, that came out of the, the marble mines in Alabama. It's like that forms that, it's like, so, you've got these kinds of, I think, urban dialectics that are at work, and maybe architecture is about bringing some of those kind of embedded and kind of suppressed stories of those materialities into an aesthetic realm, into another way of story, narrating kind of what's going on in a building, what's kind of, and I think that that's why I wanted to show the Legacy Museum, because I think it does start to, in the way in which it sort of, it really takes the viewer into this kind of underground, and it flips the script in a sense, and not to put it too crudely, but it sort of, it reorganizes the weight of that witnessing. And I think buildings that can start to understand their weight in a sense, and their kind of, and their gravity in different kinds of ways, and narrate their materials differently, to draw attention to, or to kind of, speak to some of those embedded histories, I think is, is one way to, I don't know. I mean, do you have just to flip the question back, do you have kind of ideas about that?
I think, oh, I'm sorry, Kathryn. Elijah, I love your question. We're doing bad architecture is really hard work, like so complicated, and just with a limited time, trying to do the good thing. Anything you do, like a garage addition, I don't care, it's predicting some kind of future. There's kind of a futurism at work, but I love the idea of the suppressed stories of materiality brought into the aesthetic. One thing I also loved what you said is this different epistemic system from resources to life. I mean, that could change the way that you would approach a design investigation. My own work in water is all about really thinking about connections between buildings and landscapes, and kind of a replenishing or a regenerative approach. But I even think just shifting that frame, you might go about a design intervention or investigation in a different way than you might ordinarily. But I love this conversation, and I'm so glad that we're having it.
Yeah, I wonder a little bit about this question of labor, and where that fits in for you, Kathryn. I mean, especially relative to your point, Brooke, I think I was struck exactly by the same thing, this idea of a narrative behind the material. And I think that's something that, at least in architecture, we suffer from, because we have worked very, very hard to distance ourselves as much as possible from labor. And that's both the labor of the extraction production of our materials, but also the actual production of these assemblies that we are proposing. So just to kind of bring it back to you, Kathryn, I'm wondering a little bit how, and we've seen a little bit how labor fits into what you're looking at, but I think maybe just a little bit more, sort of in our context, like how do you see that, and how can we also, to kind of bring it back to Elijah's question, how do we start to break it, particularly as we're learning architecture, as we're trying to get into the practice of architecture today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I'm very convinced by Tiffany King's kind of, of attack on labor in that particular context, right, in the afterlives of enslavement, that actually it's not labor, it's fungibility, it's kind of production of a certain kind of subjecthood that cannot kind of be conceived within labor, because then immediately you start to kind of, then you start to kind of re-narrativize the making of the nation state as this kind of like co-production, very unequal relations. And it doesn't really, I think it doesn't really get at the violence of those forms and their kind of ongoing carceral presence. But I think there's another question there about the kind of distance in terms of architecture, and that kind of, and that is the kind of aesthetic prize, in a sense, of materials, kind of, so, there's lots of ways you can kind of think about that in terms of like commodity chain analysis, and, but that doesn't really get at, I think, the kind of ways in which, a building continues to participate in those flows, right? In air conditioning, in whoever has to clean the building, whoever kind of like maintains the building, and all its, and its energy, and it's kind of, so in that sense, it's, it's metabolizing the kind of geologic strata, continuously. So it's not just the building is one iteration of that, and that sets the terms, but it continues to kind of produce and reproduce those relationships. So I think kind of, I'm obviously not an architect, but I think thinking about those kind of spatial relations in the building, as through this kind of, maybe this question of where does the building end and the planet begin, if you start to sort of explode the building through its kind of inverse geographies, then you get a very different understanding of what the building is, right? Because the building is the planet, and it is kind of, so then there's a different set of responsibilities and understandings that have to be kind of mobilized. If that makes sense.
It totally makes sense.
It really does.
But obviously there's a dissonance between that and a CAD program. I don't know whether you still use CAD, but maybe that was a while ago. But it's but if we think about these kind of technologies like LiDAR, for example, that are used for mapping, they're a way of creating and visualizing a whole set of extraneous relations, right, while also kind of being the technologies of extraction of and so on. So yeah, I think there's also questions around technology here that I'm not sure that I'm best placed to answer, but I think they trying to think about technologies that enable a kind of more expansive geography, so set of geographies.
Well, I would say, for example, when we think about passive design, passive heating, cooling, lighting, and ventilating buildings, and trying to optimize natural systems, in some cases, the technology is pretty low, and it becomes the space. Like the way that you're bringing energy is through the sun, and the way you're bringing light, air, water, movement. and suddenly the whole question of how you operate a building becomes fundamentally different and interactive. And I don't know, I mean, but it's just really helpful to be thinking about this in terms that I've never really thought about it before. It's really, really thought-provoking.
I mean, I think one kind of way in which, like, from Anthropocene science that has really helped me in terms of my thinking, it's like that scientists will talk about a kind of, you know, that the Earth is at its present state is one, you know, one possibility amongst many. And, you know, there's been all these different versions of the Earth. So if we think about the Earth and Earth processes as a kind of iterative moment that is organized through particular kind of colonial Anthropocenic relations, and then that also has the kind of, it can be a different iteration, right? And you know, if the building is one iteration of a set of kind of Earth practices, it can also be a different kind of iteration that produces a different Earth in a sense. You know, and actually thinking at the sort of granular level rather than a sort of abstract planetary level is much more helpful in thinking about how we might actually sort of get towards kind of, you know, a less uneven environment and a more sustainable future.
Well, we have a little bit of time still before we all have to run to studio, but I did want to open up the floor to anyone else in the audience. You can either raise your hand or you can type into the Q&A.
I mean, just to say, I'd really love to hear how you know, just thinking about some of these questions.
Oh, looks like Destiny has.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, so actually I really enjoyed your lecture. I'm actually one of the students that went on the spring break trip to Alabama with Blaine and Emily and Greg. So I actually have like some experience with the Legacy Museum and the memorial that you're explaining and talking about. My question is, how did you become interested in the intersection of geography, race, and the environment? You know, like what motivated you to continue that exploration?
That's I mean, a great question. I started off in climate change sort of research and geographies of climate change, and then I was doing a lot of work around geology, and then in the archives I realized the kind of, you know, co-natal moment of the organization of the Earth and the organization of people in the Earth as kind of racialized subjects. And that's like, once that kind of, but it also kind of, that was also to do with the kind of, you know, thinking about the kind of proximities to environmental harm and that, you know, are always kind of racialized. But putting those two things together for me just made it impossible to think about the environment without race. And I think that racial justice has to come before environmental justice, that those two things can't be separated because they actually belong to the same sort of epistemic narrative that we still live with today, you know, and obviously live with in very different ways. So yeah, that was my trajectory through that. And so that's why, you know, my kind of work in a sense to quite a swerve towards thinking about race and why that now, you know, is and will be the basis of my kind of future work. Because it's very, if you're in particularly environmental policy spaces, it's incredibly easy not to think about race because they're completely dominated. So, you know, I wrote Black Anthropocenes at a time as a, you know, when I was in all these spaces, you know, with kind of predominantly white men, you know, talking about the future of the Earth. And so that was a very particular kind of attempt at an intervention in that. But if we're talking about Earth futures and we don't have a diverse contingency of people in the room, then we probably have no right to be talking about the future at all. So that's kind of where I am now. But I'd love to hear about your ideas around that, Destiny, if you've got anything you want to share.
I mean, I really do agree with you. I think this whole topic of discussion is just really mind-blowing. I was actually a minor in geology, and I would not have put the two together. So I just think it's amazing, it's mind-blowing, and I'm glad to have even been a part of the panel and just to have been here to like hear it and witness it for myself. It's pretty awesome. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Destiny. That's great. But yeah, I mean, but well, then that, like, geologists don't talk about this stuff, but it was geologists that were making all these narratives of race and through comparative anatomy. And yeah.
How does so I know that your upcoming book addresses, racial geologies of rocks. So like, how did you get all this information and compile it into a book in a way that, is expressed your thoughts and feelings, but also can help others understand where you're coming from? Because this is it's a very big topic and a very big thing to kind of like put into a book and then expect others to understand. I mean,
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's why it's taken me 10 years to write it, is because, yeah. And it's very interdisciplinary. And I guess I came down to the thing of just like, I would just try and provide lots of different ways in. And that's maybe something when you're doing interdisciplinary work, is just trying to sort of have as many access points, and yeah, and I don't know, it felt like something that needed to be written, but it took a long time, and I hope that it's sort of accessible. But I guess kind of parallel to that process, I do a lot of talks and with artists and kind of and have been the things I showed you there from planetary portals is just like trying to try different mediums. So that was the first time we'd done a performance as academics, which is like it was quite a challenging thing to do, but yeah, I think kind of just trying to talk to lots of different audiences and through lots of different media, I think is one way to try and tell those stories. But I think there's also like lots of really great younger geographers and people in anthropology and so on that are really doing this work at a kind of very place-based level. So if you go to see JT Roan's lecture, I think this evening, he's doing some excellent work in kind of really place-based thinking around these kind of questions. But thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions from the rest of the audience? We have a few people sticking around.
Think about to the students how you're going to present your studio project. That's one thing I start thinking about too. But I think just narratives, the narratives that we construct, and I think in architecture it's so complicated, like I said, that we kind of latch onto narratives and we run with them, and sometimes we need to step back and ask the kinds of questions that you brought up today, and it hopefully will have the effect, project by project, of the next iteration, which I also really appreciate, of transforming the way we make things.
Yeah, I find it's a constant mystery, the extent to which architecture has such a significant material and social impact, on the order of something like 40% of resource consumption, right? Alone. And yet it's such an abstract kind of process or practice with regard to human intervention or activity, and also the material extraction, right? I don't know where the materials in my office came from, right? Or who touched them, or who, right? So just for example, right? And it's such a kind of abstract practice in studio and even in practice often. So I think that, I mean, your scholarship is so pivotal in so many ways. It's so mind-opening, as Destiny described well, and really inspires us to take that much needed next step of many steps to really uncover those deeper histories and ongoing activity. As you talked about, this sort of ongoing metabolism, right, of the buildings and that we have in existence that require more maintenance and material intervention, et cetera. So this is real time. And so it's deeply, deeply inspiring work. And I really appreciate you sharing it with us, Kathryn. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I mean, it's interesting to think where, I mean, do you know what your studio is built on top, what kind of is buried below? Just even thinking about these kinds of buried histories of the soil as a kind of archive of memory and of kind of forgetting.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. And this will be recorded for later viewing. But Kathryn, please, we look forward to keeping in touch with you, learning more about your work. Best of luck to you and your teaching and your field trips upcoming. And look forward to reading your next book.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for.
Thank you so much. Very inspiring. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.